Welcome back. This is part 2 of the tutorial on room building. In this half, we apply different shaders to the room and furniture using the Material Editor, add lighting, and introduce cameras to reproduce our photographic sources. We are going to apply shaders to everything in this room. We press M for the Material Editor, M, and we want the Slate Material Editor. Under Modes, we can see Compact and Slate. If we were on the Compact Material Editor, it would look like this. Please choose the Slate Material Editor. In the Slate Material Editor, it is very easy to grab a material, bring it into our workspace, double-click on it so it has dotted lines around it, and then view its parameters here in the lower right. I will grab out a standard material. I will double-click on it to make its parameters visible, and I will change the name of this material to walls. In order to see how light is going to work effectively in the scene, we're going to set all the colors for everything in this room to the same light gray. That's 200 for red, 200 for green, hitting tab, 200 for blue. The same light gray for everything. But we will use different shader properties, including the specular level and the glossiness, the self-illumination, and even some opacity to change the way the surface reflects light, and therefore changing the way it feels like a different material. We could also change the shader from Blinn, which is the Uber shader in Max. In Maya, that would be a bit more plasticky. We can change from Blinn to something more like Orthographic Blinn, which is a bit more soft. So a skin texture, a cloth texture. We could choose Fong for something very, very bright, metal for something that is metal. But for now, Blinn is going to be fine, at least for the walls. I can now select all the walls by going to the Layer Manager, click on the Wall Layer, hit Select, and then I can hit this button right here, Assign Material to Selection, and they all get the same gray. Alternatively, I can use this little circle and wire out a connection. So for example, I want to go to the plane. And now that ground plane is the same gray. And if I bring back the ceiling, I can wire this to the ceiling. And so now all of those are the same gray. In truth, there are some things in this room that I'd like to have a different gray. For example, I would like the cloth of this curtain to be reflect light differently than the walls. So I'll grab out another standard, double click on it, so the dotted lines are around this standard material, and so these parameters relate to this standard material, not to this one. And I will call this curtain. I'll change it from Blinn to Orthographic Blinn, and I will increase the specularity and decrease the glossiness so I get a wider bright spot. And then I will wire this to the cloth. I'll first make sure that only that is selected, or better yet, that nothing is selected. And I should take a moment to make sure that the correct side of this spline is actually facing the camera. I hit Shift Q, and it is. That's fine. So now I can wire the curtain material on, and if I hit Shift Q, we can see how it reflects light a little bit differently from what's around it. That will be even more pronounced once we have lights in the scene. I can now add a standard material, And for the moment, I'll call this just furniture. This I'll make slightly more reflective on the walls. And I'll apply it to all this furniture. I'll put it on the couch, on the tables, on this other couch, and I'll put it on all of the things here on this top. So now at least I have a basic texture on all those pieces. Assuming that this frame here is metal on the outside and glass on the inside, I would want a multi-sub-object material to have two separate shaders. I would first create a standard that I could double-click and change to metal. Give that a great deal of specularity, a little bit of glossy as well. Maybe 200 for specular. And I would wire that into slot number 1. And another standard material that I would wire into number 2. If I double-click on the multi-sub-object, I can set the number to only 2, so that I just have the metal and the glass, the metal and the non-metal backing. I'll call this metal. I'll call this one backing. I'll call this picture frame. If I apply this to that box, only one of them is going to be applied so far. Because only one of them currently fulfills the material ID that is already on this box. If we scroll down, you can see that if everything is ID number 1, it all gets the metal shader. But if I click in the center and set this to ID number 2, you can see a difference between the backing and the metal around it. This object here is meant to be a glass vase. Bringing back the material editor by hitting M, I create a new standard material that I will call glass. Or to be more precise, glass vase. I'll now give this an opacity of perhaps only 50% and make it two-sided. I apply this to the vase and it becomes semi-transparent. If I hit Shift-Q, we can see that semi-transparency. All of these should have the same diffuse color of 200 by 200 by 200 for the purposes of seeing how lighting will work in the scene. Going back to the glass vase, I'd want to increase the specular and probably increase the glossiness. I could change this from blend to anisotropic. Anisotropic allows us to have a linear highlight, which can be enormously effective for something like glass, especially on a somewhat linear object. A little bit of self-illumination is also helpful for something that's glass, two-sided, 50% opacity, 75 specular, 80 anisotropy. This is pretty good. If we hit Shift-Q again, we can see the glass is much more reflective and much more believable as glass. While this jug is a different kind of glass and should reflect light differently, for now I'll give it the same one for the sake of speed. In addition to changing the parameters of a material, its specularity, its glossiness, its self-illumination, we can have a big impact by adding a map to the specular or the bump channel. In this case, let's put a wood texture as the specularity on the wooden tables and a cloth texture as the bump map on the couches. Once again, M for materials, add a new standard. I'm going to title this Wood. Set the color to the same 200 by 200 by 200 light gray. And then go down to specular level, not specular color, specular level. Drag out a wire and release. This is all with the left mouse. Release on the empty space to grab a file. Most of these are parametric options, but the top one, bitmap, allows us to access a file from the hard drive. And I prepared this wood material. If we look closely at the material itself, we can see the light reflecting. If we grab this table and wire it on, and then hit Shift-Q for render, we can begin to see some wood in the detail, some of the grain, the way it reflects light. And importantly, as the camera moves over the surface, that will change. In order for that to display properly, we should apply a UVW map. The best way to access UVW maps is to put them up here in the buttons. These buttons are made visible by hitting Show Buttons, the second option available when clicking on this button here. And then scroll down to choose UV coordinate modifiers. And then UVW map is visible. And for something boxy like this, to do a quick, cheap mapping, I can simply choose box. And now if I hit Shift-Q, I can really see that wood grain across the entire surface. Convert this to Poly. Now let's take a look at this also on this table. Wire in the material, apply UVW map, box, convert to Poly, Shift-Q, and we get that wood result. If the floor has wood paneling, then we might expect to see the same thing, or perhaps we create a new material, 200, 200, 200, specular level, bitmap, and perhaps we get a wood pattern that actually has slats in it. And apply that to the floor. To make those slats thinner, we can double-click on the actual map and set the tiling. Instead of 1 by 1, we could set it perhaps to 3 by 3. tripling the number of tiles will decrease the size of each by a third. And so we get thin lines that are a bit more believable. If we want those lines to go in a different direction, instead of horizontally this way to make them vertical, we can change the angle. (90 degrees), Shift Q to render, and they go in the opposite direction. If we double-click on a map and then hit this button, Show Shaded Map in Viewport, we can see it as visible. Though remember, this is not the diffuse color. This is the specular level. This will just affect how it reflects light. And so as the camera moves, it reflects light differently. Now let's try a bump map on the couches. New standard material. (200, 200, 200). Call this couches, and go down to bump to get a bitmap, and choose a cloth. I prepared this cloth. In its parameters, we can set it to 5 by 5, and we can view the image. This is the material that I prepared. Wire it to the two couches, and see the results. This one is very streaky, this one I'm not seeing much at all. In both cases, I still need to apply a UVW map. The default map is coming out pretty poor. So I'll select this couch, hit UVW map, and box, hit Shift Q, and the result might be too small and tiled to really be visible. So instead of 5 by 5, let's try something much smaller, 2 by 2, which will mean we're only asking the tiling image to be reduced by half. I'm going to go back to even just 1 by 1. And that's a pretty intense bump map. All bump maps by default, if we go to what is running the maps, we can go down here to maps, by default are set to a value of 30. If I bring this down to 10, that decreases the bump. What a bump does is it fakes the appearance of additional geometry by creating highlights and shadows. If we decrease the power of that bump, we lessen the intensity of those highlights and shadows. I think I will also set this to Orine or Blinn instead of Blinn, and I will give this more specularity and a lot less glossiness. Shift Q again. That's pretty okay for now. Certainly it's way too bumped down here. When we bring in actual lighting, this will look a little better. Convertible Poly. This one also gets a UVW map, spherical, planar, box. Convert to Convertible Poly. Hitting spherical and planar makes the UVW map equal in all sides. Not sure I did that for the big one. UVW map, spherical, planar, box, convert to Convertible Poly, Shift Q. Pretty good. Okay, so now I think we're ready to deal with some lighting. To add light to this scene, we look at the photo references taken of this room. Here we can see 3 images of this room, photographs taken of the original, that give us some sense of how this room was lit in reality. Overall, this room was fairly dark when photographed, but we can see little splashes of yellow, probably from the skylight above. And from inside, we're seeing a lot of the red and the oranges of the walls reflected back at us. And so those are the primary colors we're looking at in this room. Some cooler colors for shadows, but for the most part, lots of red, lots of orange, and the yellow from outside. So let's start by going to Create, Lights, and instead of photometric, choosing a standard light, let's choose a free direct to be our sunlight. We'll start outside and expand this light to encompass the entire space. At something of an angle, so that the other windows on the side can also participate in adding light to this room. Going to the local for this gizmo, I can shrink its distance just for easier manageability. I want to encompass but not go much further. That's pretty good. And then the parameters for this light, we're going to turn on shadows. Under intensity color attenuation, the multiplier value is how bright this light is. And the color, we said we wanted to be at least a little yellow. The shadow by default is set to shadow map. Because this is a direct light, those shadows will be straight. They'll be parallel to each other in the way that a real sunlight source would create. Because the sun is so far away, the shadows it casts are parallel. All of the light sources inside the room are going to be spotlights or omnis, light sources that create angled shadows. Now might be a good time to remove the image from the background, and then to set a color to the background for the render. We hit the number 8 on the keyboard and change the background color to the background color of those photographs, which was slightly bluish, very, very slight. There were also trees and other things like that in the background, which we're not worrying about for now. But we want something that we can recognize as a sky. Hitting P allows us to look inside of the room. Control Alt middle mouse allows us to zoom smoothly. And if we hit Shift Q, we can begin to see the outside color and a little bit of the light coming in through the window and what it's going to illuminate. I should be more precise about trying to reproduce the photographs and getting this to really fall on the couch. But for now, I'm just going to add a few more lights to begin to illuminate the rest of the room. I can start by figuring out where the other light sources are. In this case, it might unfortunately be from the flash of the camera. Typically, you want your light sources to be the light that's in the room itself. If we assume that this room has a light above, or perhaps it's simply these lamps sprinkled around the room, each of those could be a spotlight. So I'll get a free spot, And looking from above, I'll put one here to go near, but not exactly inside of this lamp. Now might be a good time to hide the walls, and especially the ceiling, so we can more easily see what we're doing. Because ceiling had a check mark, these new lights all went in there. Let's make a new layer for lights. We'll call it lights. And we can select these lights and put them in there. We want the light to be slightly outside of the mesh, because otherwise it will have some problems with how it displays. Right now I'm having difficulty manipulating because this lamp, this light, extends so far down. But if I reduce this value, this targeted value, my life gets to be a little bit easier. So now I'll move this outside of the lamp. Intensity color attenuation. I'm going to reduce the multiplier value to maybe 0.7 because there'll be a few of these. And I'm going to make this more of an orangey hue. I'm also going to go down to spotlight parameters and dramatically increase the fall off and increase the hotspot at least a little bit. According to my photographs, there's another important lamp over here that I have not modeled. I'll make this a copy, and I'll make this light a bit more red and a bit brighter. Also a little bit higher. Now if I bring back the ceiling and the walls, we can see what effect this has on the appearance of the room when we render. We're certainly getting a warm hue in here where the spotlights are casting. But above we get nothing. And so what we need to do is we fake a bounced light. We can do this by either grabbing an omni, putting this in the room. In fact, we can put it below the room and have it cast its light upwards. Or we can get a spotlight and have it shine up. For now I'm going to use this omni. The omni does not get shadows. This is meant to fake bounce light. It's not an actual light source. I'll make this a little bit warmer. Not quite that warm. And have a multiplier value of only something like 0.5. I want to make sure that shadows are turned on for these two spotlights. And it would also be good to set the shadow color on those spotlights, which is available under shadow parameters, to something somewhat bluish, even if it's a very dark blue. And to lower the density, maybe to only something like 0.8. Again, something bluish. In this case, maybe only 0.7. And also for this light, this I'll make somewhat purplish because it's a yellow light, complementary color. And the density may be also only 0.8. And now if we hit Shift Q, the room is suffused with the one color. We have the brighter areas from the lighting. and then what's visible through the skylights. So this could certainly use some more work, but this is giving us the beginning of a sense of lighting in this room. Lighting that shows us how color is bouncing off the walls. That red, that orange may actually be the wallpaper or the paint on the walls. We are representing it as light. The last step covered by this video tutorial is to add cameras to the scene that match our 3 photographic sources so that we can test, are all the proportions of the scene really accurate to the photographs, and is the lighting as accurate as we can make it to the reality. We start by going in the perspective view, hitting Shift F to give us safe frame. Safe frame shows us what the renderer will actually render, so we can see the true width and height and the cropping of the scene. In the render settings, which is normally hit by F10, we can set the output size to match what we want. 800 by 600 is a good aperture if you're trying to match a photograph. 720 by 480 is better for video. I will now attempt to match the display in these photographs. I'm going to start with this wide shot. I'm doing this purely in the perspective view. And I'm looking to see how much of each of these parts of the room is visible. One thing to note is that these doors are open, and this camera is really being taken from outside of the room. So I should select each of these doors, use Effect Pivot only to move their pivots to where the doors would naturally open. And I should rotate these out. One thing I can see right away is it looks as if the furniture should be significantly smaller in this room than I have placed it, or that the diagrams indicated. This piece should be rotated away. I think I will select all the furniture and shrink each item according to its own parameters. First, I need to deselect the floor. I think that looks a little bit more accurate. This unit should be smaller as well. And certainly I would spend more time on this and really strive for accuracy. But for now, that's pretty decent. What I really want to see is that all of the edges of the geometry, all the ways in which they are cropped, match the photographs. So here, where I can't see the very, very bottom of this couch, that should be matched in this photo. Whether I'm moving the objects or I'm moving the camera. On this side I can see the door, on this side I can see the door, so I should be able to see each of those as well. I think I'll push in a little bit, move this couch away a little bit. I should be able, according to this photograph, to see a bit more of the ceiling, which implies I need to rotate up a little bit. And I should be able to see more of this table and these chairs. So I'll also rotate in. And then move some of these items over. All these things on this table are going to need to be fixed because I scaled them all. But overall, that's looking a little bit closer to accurate. And now that I have this view, I hit Control-C, and I'm able to create a new camera that captures this view. I hit T for top, and I will call this camera camera 001 underscore wide. This is my wide shot. We will get slightly better results with this camera if we change its aperture from the default to 35 millimeters, which will more naturally represent our photograph. If the camera is selected and we hit the letter C, our view snaps to that camera. If there is only one camera in the scene, hitting C will snap to the camera whether or not it is selected. If there are multiple cameras in the scene and none of them are selected, hitting the letter C will bring up a list of all the possible cameras, and you can choose the one in which you want to look. With this camera selected, camera 001 wide, and since we're looking through it, as we can see here in the upper left-hand corner of the viewport, we can now change the millimeters of the camera, the lens, and we will see the results. It pops us out a little bit, and the controls here in the lower right, if we're in the camera view, have changed to camera controls. If we hit Alt-W, split the screen to a camera view and a top view, we can see what happens to the camera as we dolly forward. It's literally pushing the camera in. And this 35 millimeter view does a pretty good job of matching the reality in the photograph. So now that we have the first camera, deselect, and we're going to do the second camera, which is looking at this one corner. P for perspective. You have to be in perspective view to be able to capture a camera, to create a camera in that view. Of course, I should hit Shift F, so I'm seeing the actual aperture. I should be able to see a little bit of the corner of the ceiling. This corner, the top of this curtain, the top of this curtain. And a little bit of the couch. So I'm guessing I should pull back just enough. get that couch. That looks pretty good. Once again, with no camera selected, I hit Control C. If the old camera was selected when I hit Control C, it would not create a new camera. It would snap the existing selected camera to the new view. Since we like the old camera, we like that it's showing the wide shots, we really want to make sure that no camera is selected. This new camera that was just created by hitting Control C with no camera selected, we change the name to camera 002 underscore medium. This is our medium shot. Once again, we set it to 35 millimeters. And something we should do to all of these cameras for this tutorial is we really want them to be free cameras and not target cameras. So we can do that here, make it a free camera. And that allows us a little bit more flexibility as we're moving things around. So now we have these two cameras. This one will also set to being a free camera. The final view is this close-up of the items that are on this table. All of these items need to be arranged. We move this piece there. Here's this book. The book should be rotated 180 degrees and made significantly smaller. The camera actually is intended to crop out the bottom of the table but show a significant amount of what's above. This book is half out of the scene, or if not half, at least the corner. This picture frame should be rotated away, and I suspect a little bit taller. Again, we scale on the vertices, not on the object level, to avoid problems to the X-form. This jug should be a bit smaller. This vase could also be a bit smaller, and there should be two of them. Probably a good idea to make this an instance. This tissue box should be a bit smaller and angled like so, the long part facing us. Pretty good. We hit Shift Q. We can see how they match up. Not too shabby. We hit Control C, and we have our third camera, which we call camera 003 underscore close. And now with three cameras, we set it to 35 millimeters, push in a little bit more, and make it a free camera. And now, with three cameras, we are able to spend time tweaking the lighting and tweaking the positions and the relative sizes of all the contents to get this to really be as accurate to the photographs as we possibly can. And that's it for today on how to create an accurate room interior. I hope you enjoyed. Thanks for watching.